Hello and welcome to a new video. After a little bit of a break, I'm back and I'm back today with a special video because today we are going to take a look at some overlooked and or underrated leaders and wonders synergies and combinations. And before we are starting with that, I first want to tell you a little bit of the backstory of the idea for this video, because I had the idea for this video already some while ago at the end of last year, when I thought about a specific wonder and wonder combination, which also will be featured in this video, where I thought, oh, that's actually quite synergistic and maybe not really talked about that much. And then I thought, oh, that could be an interesting video idea, talking about such combinations that maybe are quite synergistic but aren't actually talked about or maybe overlooked by a lot of players. So that was the idea, and as you know, once per month my Patreon supporters can vote for a video, and I thought, oh, that could be a very nice option to give them to vote for, and so I put it into the vote, and it got voted for, but that was now already half a year ago. I If I would have been on time, I should have done this video in January, so already sorry for the delay. But the problem that I realized after, yeah, thinking about this Wonder Wonder combination is that it's actually not that easy after we are all playing the game for that long to find some really synergistic combinations that aren't really talked about at all, because yeah, most of the strong combinations are of course quite obvious. Maria Theresa and Ocean Liner Service. um, I don't know, there are so many combinations, but none of them would feel like, oh, that's actually an interesting combination that I didn't think about before. So Chaplin in Hollywood, there are just a lot of those combinations that I also often talk about in my Leaders and Wonders overview at the beginning of and taking a look at the game. So I actually struggled a little bit to find some more of those combinations, and then I procrastinated over it and wasn't too happy about what combinations I had in mind. And yeah, and so the video got quite a bit delayed. But now we will do the video, and I have 10 Leaders and Wonders combinations, or some are actually some Wonder and Wonder combinations, or some Leader into Leader synergies. And I hope that at least some of them will maybe be interesting for you. Some of them are maybe relatively obvious, but I think maybe that they are a bit underrated, or that they are especially strong, and that it is maybe worth talking about. And so I will just talk about those 10 synergies that I thought about now for a long time, which doesn't mean that they will be completely mind blowing for you. But I hope it will still be an interesting video to maybe take a look about some interesting combinations, and of course I will also tell you a little bit about how you can implement this in an actual game, and so I hope there will be some useful information for you. Alright, so that for the backstory of the video. And yeah, I think we can maybe immediately start with the Wonder and Wonder combination that was maybe a little bit the idea for the video, that a Wonder and Wonder combination that I think is quite synergistic. Maybe a combination that works especially good in two-player games, but can definitely also shine in three and four-player games. And that Wonder and Wonder combination is the Acropolis plus the Forbidden City. And I do think that is quite synergistic on various or in not in just one way, but in multiple ways. Because first of all, with having the Acropolis, you of course ideally want to maybe go for some more urban buildings if somehow possible, and then the ignored unhappy workers of the Forbidden City help you with maybe putting maybe a worker into an additional lab and having more urban buildings around. And that of course will mean that you can get a bigger discount for a government farm. So we have that as a very nice synergy. Additionally, though, with the Acropolis, you ideally want to use it relatively early in the game to get some early value out of it, to maybe be able to snowball a little bit. So normally I think it's best to use the Acropolis to go into an H1 government form, and then thanks to the discount it's often possible to then also go for an H3 government form. So I think that's often the ideal way to use the Acropolis. And when you go into an H1 government form, that is then either monarchy or theocracy, then, especially to make it work a little bit more long term, I think it's just very strong to get an additional civil action on top of that. So instead of maybe, if you, for example, miss out on the code of laws, be stuck on 5 civil actions, which at some point will be very limiting, thanks to the additional civil action from the Forbidden City, the early government form that you get into thanks to the Acropolis, and maybe at a bigger discount thanks to the ignored unhappy worker from the Forbidden City, you then get a civil action from the Forbidden City on top of that, which makes the H1 government form actually a lot more viable. And then after you have that government form, and especially when we are maybe now taking a look at the 2-player game, where I think this combination can especially be very strong, then you can maybe just in H2 go for a culture leader and go for a lot of urban buildings, and thanks to the ignored unhappy workers, you maybe don't have to do a big investment into a happy face solution. Maybe even going for some dramas or operas can be enough to just cover all of your needs for the happy faces for a while, and that will also then help you to get an even bigger discount for an H3 government form that you maybe want to go into in H3. And when you should manage to go into that H3 government form, then you also have a really nice amount of civil actions to work with in H3. So in 2-player games I think that's quite strong, but also in 3 and 4-player games I think that can work quite well. Of course the Acropolis is generally not that strong in those player counts, maybe especially in 4-player games, but nonetheless, with the Forbidden City, maybe sometimes it can work to put work into a 3rd lab, and also it is also in those player accounts still true that if you go for an H1 government form with the Acropolis, that then the additional civil action from the Forbidden City is especially useful. So I do think that is actually quite a strong combination, and it's a combination that I haven't heard that much talk about, to be honest. Maybe it's just obvious for a lot of you, and it's probably not mind-blowing or anything, but but I think it's quite a strong combination to have in mind. And in 3 and 4-player games, sometimes maybe can even the deciding factor on whether I actually want to go for the Acropolis or not, if maybe this decision is close. Alright, so that was the first Wonder and Wonder combination, and we will still not take a look at the Leader and Wonder combination, because we will now continue with the Leader into Leader synergy. And we will continue with that because I think this Leader into Leader synergy actually works quite well with the Wonder and Wonder synergy that we just talked about. And that Leader into Leader synergy is probably not that new. I think especially some years ago it was a combination that was often talked about, especially in the maybe streams of DJ Parson or something, and it's maybe also because it is also maybe especially strong in 2-player games, so it's maybe not the biggest mind-blowing combination to tell you, but I just thought it's maybe still worth remembering about this Leader into Leader synergy, and especially for 2-player games, and that is Gutenberg into Bach. And yeah, Gutenberg, if you have him, you ideally of course want to get a lot of activations out of him. And especially in 3 and 4-player games, it can be sometimes you can just take the alchemy, develop the alchemy, go for some upgrades, and especially if there's a military struggle going on, then it can be quite challenging to get maybe even more activations, to maybe go for either also printing presses or journalism, or maybe go for a 3rd lab. But if you at some point secure Bach, you can maybe use Gutenberg to go into a 3rd lab, even though you know that you maybe can't sustain it for too long, because you know that as soon as you will then go for Bach later on, you can just turn it into a happy face and that happy phase will then maybe help you to not have an uprising issue when you lose the 2 yellow tokens to the end of the age, or maybe allows you to put an additional work into the military to then be safer again. So you can get another Gutenberg activation sometimes out of that, thanks to being able to build an additional lab. You can get the economical value of what the additional lab offers you. For example, if you build an alchemy, that will just be 2 science production that you have for a while, and you can do that even in a situation when you normally maybe would say, nah, I can't afford to put this population into the lab. I will soon maybe need a happy phase, or it would cause some issues. But with Bach, you are able to relatively shortly after just turn it into an opera, and you were able to build a lab with a discount, so you saved some resource into the process. You already got some science production out of it, and yeah, and that can be quite strong, especially of course in a 2-player game where first of all Gutenberg is especially strong and Bach is especially strong. So that combination may be also especially strong in 2-player games. But as I said, in 3 and 4-player games, it can be harder to maybe put the work into the third lab, but this leader into leader synergy can maybe make it work for you. So that can be quite nice. And as I said, this leader into leader synergy works actually quite well with the Acropolis plus the Forbidden City, because thanks to the ignored unhappy workers from the Forbidden City, it's more easily possible to build a third lab. And if you have the Acropolis, potentially even a 4th lab. And then it's of course quite strong to then go for Bach, and with then going for a bunch of dramas or operas with Bach plus the Forbidden City, you might even have your happy phases covered. So I think, if of course that will not happen a lot of time, but if you should manage to get that wonder and wonder combination together with Gutenberg and Bach, that I think can work quite well. And I actually remember a specific game situation. I sadly can't show it to you because I didn't write it down. It's already a while ago. But I do remember a game that I had where I had the Acropolis in the Forbidden City, and I had Gutenberg and Bach, and I actually was able to put a 4th worker into alchemies, knowing that I can shortly after turn it into an opera with Bach. And yeah, I got a lot of Gutenberg activations in that game. So no, that so I think that works also quite synergistic together. So that's why I wanted to talk about Gutenberg and Bach immediately after the Acropolis in the Forbidden City. But now we will talk about something completely new and unrelated, and it will also be now finally the first leader and wonder combination. And to be honest, that is probably quite a bit of a niche combination, but maybe also because of that a combination that you maybe haven't thought about that much before. But to be honest, it will be very rarely that you can really abuse this, or that you can make this work quite nicely. But I actually had it work in maybe 1 or 2 games, and it's at least nice to have it in mind that this can potentially be quite strong. Normally it maybe happens maybe more accidentally that you stumble upon that and that you then can make it work somewhat nicely, but sometimes you can maybe actually really abuse it. And the leader and wonder combination that I'm talking about is Anthony Gaudi and Spaceflight. And yeah, that is something that maybe very rarely will be an extremely strong combination, but it's at least something where it's good to have that in mind. Because when you have Anthony Gaudi, and if you maybe manage to actually go already into 4 or let's say even 5 different urban buildings at the end of age 2, I guess that's a bit of a stretch, but maybe in age 3 you will manage to go into potentially even a 5th urban building. And then, first of all, you probably already developed some technology for cheaper at this point. So you got some technologies out at a discount, which later on will score you some points for the spaceflight. But as soon as you have that many different urban buildings, you can go for all of those H3 technologies, computers, multimedia, professional sports, movies at quite a big discount. So potentially a 4 or 3 science discount for all of those technologies. And that, of course, helps you to to develop those technologies at quite a cheap cost, and that can make a space flight quite a bit bigger. But of course, developing those, taking those, also takes some action. So in order to this to be actually worth it, the space flight alone is probably not enough. But if you have the space flight or know that it is in the game, and maybe you have drawn an early impact of technology, or or maybe both can be possible, Nobel is in the game and you know that there will be some Nobel prizes, then it can actually start to be quite strong, and you can maybe, because of being able to go for those cheap technologies, go for some cheap Nobel prizes, prepare for bigger impact of technology, and then make a potential space flight even bigger. And all the while, of course, getting some nice culture income out of Anthony Gaudi. It's a bit of a niche situation, and it very rarely will work really, really well, but I thought it's an interesting thing to have in mind, especially also with the Nobel Prizes. Anthony Gaudi can really help you sometimes, maybe going for a cheap Nobel Prize, for example, if you have already like for urban building technologies and you still want to go into team sports, it only costs one science, and then you just need to develop another technology and you already scored a Nobel Prize. So, yeah, I think that's a nice little synergy to have in mind, but it will be rather rare that you actually can make it work. All right, the next leader and wonder combination is probably for most of you a relatively obvious one, but I still wanted to talk about it because I think it just works so smoothly. And that combination that I'm talking about is Cleopatra plus Library of Alexandria. With having Cleopatra, the issue that you sometimes have with her, and you probably know that if you watch my videos, that you ideally, of course, want to use her ability every turn to get a discount on building the urban building or Step of a Wonder. But sometimes you want to do this, but it comes at the cost of, for example, delaying your third mine. For example, if you start with Cleopatra, build a second lab, and then in the next turn you have a wonder like the, let's say the Colossus, which is maybe not the ideal wonder for Cleopatra, but it costs 3 steps, and you can now either build the step using Cleopatra, or you can build a mine, but then you don't use Cleopatra and miss out on a little bit of value from her. And because of that, it's first of all already quite nice to have one of the 2 wonders, Stonehenge and Library, that has one step or one resourced first step, so that you can, without any issues, just build the additional mine and use Cleopatra on a Step of the Wonder without any issues. And additionally, I think if you go for Cleopatra and Library of Alexandria, you just have a very clear game plan ahead of you that you maybe sometimes shouldn't stick too heavily to, but I think oftentimes it will work quite well. You have Cleopatra, you get the Library of Alexandria, and then at the second turn you start not by opening with the second lab, and sometimes that will maybe be the correct choice, but I think it works even more smoothly with maybe opening with a third mine plus a step of the Library of Alexandria. Because if you do it like that, then at the third turn you can continue with building the second lab, and then at the fourth turn, and you don't need any help from any developments for that. You can actually just finish the Library of Alexandria. You have just enough resources for that, meaning that you didn't delay your economy, you built your third mine and you built your second lab. You used Cleopatra every turn, and because of using her every turn, you saved a total of 3 resources, which is then enough to finish the library already in turn 4 and give you a nice economical boost. And then after that, of course, you have to find something new for Cleopatra, but at this point there might be some alchemies around, or you will be able to go for a new wonder, or just replace her after she has given you some nice value in the early game. So I think that just works so extremely smoothly that if you are able to go for that combination, it's just quite strong. And it is especially strong if you manage to actually take Cleopatra plus the Library of Alexandria at your starting draft in round 1. Because normally if you take a leader and wonder at the starting draft, you then can only at the second turn elect a leader, build a mine, increase your population, but that's only 3 civil actions, meaning very often you then have to spend a 4th civil action to just take an HA yellow card, which is not that efficient. But if you have Cleopatra and Library at the starting draft, you can elect Cleopatra, you can build a mine, you can increase your population, and thanks to her additional resource, you can build a step of the Library of Alexandria. So the additional civil action, or thanks to getting a leader and a wonder already at the first turn, and then thanks to being able to build a step, you actually transfer the additional civil action a further turn down the line at it and when it maybe will be especially useful. So that I think is actually quite a strong start if you are able to pick Cleopatra and the Library of Alexandria at your starting draft. And then, of course, it's also somewhat synergistic in a balancing kind of way, because getting the Library of Alexandria running early gives you additional science production, while Cleopatra, of course, gives you additional resources. So you have a nice mix of additional resources and science in the early game, which I think also synergizes well together. So as you saw, there are a lot of layers on why I think this is especially strong, and I think it's just my favorite wonder to get with Cleopatra, and yeah, I think it always feels very smoothly. But as I said, the standard plan that I laid out to you on how you can go for a Cleopatra library is quite strong, but of course you still have to react to what is on the row, and in a two-player game sometimes it can be better to delay the second lab and leave yourself open for a printing press or something. So that's of course something to have in mind, but I think the general plan oftentimes will just be quite strong. Alright, so that was the fourth combination, and now we are coming to the fifth combination that I want to talk about, and that I think is actually a combination that is really, really strong. And I think now it maybe isn't that much of a surprise to you, because I actually think in quite a bunch of my recent videos, there were some situations when I talked about it. I think also that in the last World Championship group, I think MV had a game where he had this combination where I talked about how strong this is, if I remembered correctly. And so now it's maybe not that big of a surprise, but I have to be honest that maybe a year or two ago I had this combination not that much on my mind. Of course, if I would have thought about it, I would have realized, oh, that's quite synergistic, but now that I have it seen in actions multiple times, I actually think that is quite a strong combination. And oftentimes, the leader being in the game can, for me, be a reason whether I go for that wonder or not. And the wonder that I'm talking about is the Hanging Gardens, and the leader that I'm talking about is Barbarossa. Because usually, a while back ago, I remembered it that when you talk about some synergistic wonders for Barbarossa, you rather talk about a Colosseum or you talk about a Great Wall, and of course, those two wonders also work quite well with Barbarossa. Colosseum gives you a happy face, the additional military action, a bit of a discount for a military tech that, of course, all works very well with Barbarossa. And a Great Wall, if you go for a lot of infantry units with Barbarossa, is of course also extremely strong. It is quite a strong combination, obviously, but it's not that much of an maybe overlooked one or underrated one. I do think most of the players have this combination on their radar. And yeah, but I think the Hanging Gardens plus Barbarossa is just extremely strong, and I think nowadays I like it quite a bit more than Colosseum plus Barbarossa. Maybe that's also because I didn't go for Colosseum Barbarossa a lot recently, but yeah, I think getting the additional happy face compared to the Colosseum just is even helps you even more to actually sustain a lot of units that you build with Barbarossa. So I do think that is quite a benefit over the Colosseum. And then the buff that the Hanging Gardens has gotten with the expansion, the 2 additional food, played just an extremely important role on how strong this wonder is with Barbarossa, because in H1, 2 food will often just mean one more Barbarossa activation. And each Barbarossa activation is just worth quite a lot. You of course all know it, but I will repeat it just to make it clear. Each Barbarossa activation gives you 1 resource, 1 food, and a civil action, because you didn't need to spend a civil action to increase your population. So it's a civil action, a resource, and a food. A resource and a food, I think in H1 is maybe often worth like similar worth like a civil action. For example, oftentimes you will take a rich land for 1 civil action, which is then 2 resources, and it feels like it's a good deal. And yeah, here it's a resource and a food. So each Barbarossa activation is maybe worth somewhat as 2 civil actions, so like having 2 turns of Saladin. So each activation is worth a lot, and thanks to the Hanging Gardens, just because of the 2 food, you oftentimes will be able to go for an additional Barbarossa activation, and that will then provide you a lot of value. And then, thanks to the two happy faces, you are often able to sustain the additional unit that you build thanks to the 2 food. And oftentimes you might even be able to build that much military, and of course in a very efficient way with Barbarossa, to maybe even be threatening to potentially go for an aggression or something. And yeah, so I do think that just works extremely well together. The one thing that you, of course, are not having, which is important to have with Barbarossa, is the military action. That's something, of course, that the Colosseum offers to you. But going into something like warfare or doing a monarchy revolution, which oftentimes works quite well with Barbarossa, can give you access to the third military action. And then I think the Hanging Gardens plus Barbarossa is quite strong. Um, Especially also because the two food from the Hanging Gardens are food that, as long as you don't finish the wonder, are basically stored up. So you can go for Barbarossa, you can maybe, or you can wait for Barbarossa, you can maybe save up a little bit of food normally, but then you, at some point, if it's a bit later, you maybe have to increase your population once. But the food from the Hanging Gardens, if you finish it relatively late, you can and maybe know that you have Barbarossa, you can finish it, and then you get the food and you can spend it oftentimes immediately with Barbarossa, so that you don't have issues to maybe wait for Barbarossa and trying to store up a lot of food. That food you can easily store up by just finishing the Hanging Gardens a little bit later. So yeah, so I think that combination is quite strong. As I said, nowadays, when I think about if I should go for the Hanging Gardens, Barbarossa is the leader that, or the synergy that I'm looking out for the most. Not Michelangelo for a bit of culture, not maybe Darwin or some culture leaders. Maybe in two-player games, I'm looking a bit more at those culture leaders. But Barbarossa is the leader that I'm just, yeah, looking out for the most when I decide about going for the Hanging Gardens. And a year or two ago, that was not that much the case for me. So I think maybe for some of you it is an interesting combination to have in mind. All right, we have now talked about half of the Leaders and Wonders synergies that I have prepared, and now we will enter the second half. And we will enter it maybe again with a little bit of a more niche synergy. To be honest, it was one of the last synergies that I added to the mix because I thought I want to do 10 because it's such a nice number, and I I just was running out of ideas a little bit. But I do think it is synergistic quite nicely, and that's an H3 combination. It's Mandela and the Red Cross. So yeah, if you have Mandela, you of course score additional points for each surplus happy face that you have. And sometimes, of course, if you have a lot of food, normally you just increase your population and it's still best to do something with it. But of course, then the bonus that you get out of Mandela oftentimes will shrink a little bit. It's not too bad. Mandela gives you a civil action, gives you 2 culture by default. That is already quite nice. But if you go for the Red Cross, you have a way to spend the food without increasing your population. So you can um, turn the food into a lot of points with the Red Cross, and at the same time, you don't increase your population, meaning that you don't go more deeply into your yellow bank and can maybe also at the same time get a bigger um, amount of culture out of Mandela. So that's synergistic in that way, but of course it's also synergistic in the way that Mandela offers you an additional civil action. And the best way to go for the Red Cross is, of course, if you somehow are able to just take it and finish it in one turn, but that is quite challenging. You need maybe something like the architecture or engineering, and you need a lot of civil actions. And what is Mandela giving you? He is giving you an additional civil action, and with the increased civil action count, thanks to Mandela, it also will maybe get a lot easier to actually go for the Red Cross and finish it in one turn. So, yeah, so I think because of that, that synergy or that combination works quite well together. It's still not something that I'm looking for when I'm taking a look at the Leaders and Wonders overview, but oftentimes it also works quite well in the sense that I think if you to save up enough food for the Red Cross, it of course is helpful to have some additional yellow tokens. And sometimes you, for example, go for a bit of a Suez Canal play, and or you generally just want some yellow token colonies, or maybe you went for the statue and you have a nice yellow bank. And that maybe makes it easier for you to go for the Red Cross, but a bigger yellow bank, of course, also means that you maybe can go for more surplus happy faces with Mandela. So the general setup of having a lot of yellow tokens also works well for both the leader and the wonder. So another reason why sometimes maybe they can just work very nicely together. Now, so that I think is a nice synergy. but maybe not the most influential one, and it's not something to really look out for at the beginning of the game or something. Alright, the next synergy that I'm talking about I think is quite strong. You might argue, however, that it's maybe just strong because it's a very strong wonder and a very strong leader, but I do also think that they synergize quite well together. And when I'm doing the leaders and wonders overview at the beginning of my games, I often mention, okay, there's Railroad plus James Watt. And obviously that is some kind of synergy because James Watt allows you to maybe more easily get into coal. And if you aren't coal, then the railroad, of course, gets even stronger, and you can go into H3 with a lot of resource income. And that is a synergy, but sometimes it can also be a bit tricky to make that work, to find the civil actions to go for James Watt, coal, and the railroad, and the timing has to be somewhat right, which of course is true for somewhat true for all leaders and wonders combinations, but it is a synergy. But maybe there is a leader which potentially at least is even more synergistic with the railroad, because while James Watt of course allows you to go cheaper into coal and then you are in coal and then you can go for the railroad, he maybe doesn't help you that much to put the resources to good use, which I guess is fair enough. All of his discounts already provided you a lot of value, and he helped you going into the big resource setup. If he now also would help you to use that more efficiently, he would just probably be a bit overpowered, but nonetheless, he doesn't really help you to put the resource to good use. But if you manage to get the railroad plus Newton, I think that can work extremely well together. Because with the railroad, of course, you will have a strong amount of resources to work with. And sometimes it can be somewhat difficult to spend those resources efficiently. But if you have, first of all, more civil actions, thanks to Newton, and also additional science income to develop more technologies and develop the technologies as said for free, saving civil actions, that I think will help you a lot to actually use the additional resource from the railroad, which I think Newton is, of course, not only a nice synergy with the railroad, but also with the Machu Picchu. If you build a Machu Picchu and then get into Newton plus scientific method, I think you, especially in a 3 and 4 player game, you might be up for a very nice game. And similar it is true for the railroad. That Newton just helps you spending those additional resources. But I think Newton and the railroad can even work especially well together if you're already in iron mines. Because, of course, if you have coal mines, the railroad gives you an even bigger resource income. But if you go for Newton, ideally you want to go for H2 labs or journalisms. And maybe you were already in alchemies and then somehow went into journalisms, but that without being an iron is quite difficult. So if you have to go into coal in H2, it is somewhat challenging to maybe also go for an H2 lab or journalisms. It can work, but maybe it will be a bit later and it's not that easily possible. And building then the railroad in addition to that is somewhat challenging. So I think that combination works actually better if you have iron mines. And I generally think the railroad is already quite strong if you have iron mines. So if some of you think you kind of need to have coal mines to make that work, I would disagree. It's already quite strong with iron mines. 5 additional strength is often quite relevant, and it still gives you even more resource income, which makes you more flexible in H3. And if you have already some iron, then oftentimes it's a lot more easily possible to go into something like scientific method, which then makes it more easily, or then you can go for strong Newton. And if you are an iron mine, it also works a bit better to go into oil in H3, and getting railroad plus oil is a way, if you manage to get it early, which of course will not happen every game, but if you're prepared for that, having a railroad, being able to get into an early oil, that can really give you such a big boost in H3 that sometimes it can win you single-handedly the game. However, first of all, it is somewhat expensive to go into oil, and then again, you have a lot of resource income, but you need to spend it efficiently, and that can be some burdens or some challenges to overcome. And again, Newton helps a lot with those challenges. if you have Newton, you have a lot of science income, which makes it a lot more easily possible to afford an early oil. And oftentimes, if you want to go into the oil very early, you might have to take it for 3 and you have to upgrade. Maybe there's some other important stuff that you need to do, meaning you need a lot of civil actions. And again, Newton is giving you additional civil actions if you develop the oil. So with Newton, I think it's just generally the easiest to maybe get into an early oil in age 3. And if you then happen to also have the railroad, you are just off for a very good game, because after you then went into oil, thanks to Newton, you still have good science income and you have the additional civil actions, and that will make it hopefully relatively easily possible for you to invest all of those resources. And if that all happens, I think that's just you're off to an extremely strong end game. And now, as said, both the leader and the wonder are just strong in a vacuum, and maybe that's also because when you have both of them, that's probably good. But I think I maybe named some reasons why I think they are actually quite synergistic. And I think if you have both of them, and also with their specific buildings that they require, you are off for a very good game. And maybe I actually would say that this synergy might be even more important than railroad and watt, but that of course you can maybe argue about. Alright, so with that we can go off to the next combination. And the next combination, to be honest, is probably not any surprise for you, but I just again wanted to talk about it first of all because it features maybe my favorite wonder and because I think it is actually extremely strong to get this going. And it's a wonder and wonder combination, and it's pyramids plus the Silk Road. And yeah, that's of course not revolutionary to think about it. If you go for the Silk Road, you can play yellow cards for additional value, and in order to use a lot of yellow cards, you of course need a lot of civil actions, and the pyramids gives you that civil action. But I think that is synergistic in even more ways, because these strong HA wonders, and of course all HA wonders can shine, but the other strong HA wonders all often give you some kind of science. Library gives you science, Stonehenge gives you additional science, Roman roads, at least in H2, gives you additional science, and those might be the strongest wonders after the pyramids. And so that just shows that additional science is quite strong in the early game. And of course the pyramids gives you a civil action that is quite strong, but if you don't get any leader together with the pyramids or no setup that gives you additional science, you can still struggle a little bit. So the Silk Road will then also come in handy, because if you manage to build the pyramids and then go for the Silk Road, you get a little bit of additional science income. That will then be a quite nice implementation or combination together with already additional civil action from the pyramids. And so I think that is then quite helpful. And also, the culture income should not be underestimated here, because sometimes what can happen if you go for the pyramids, maybe especially in 2 and 3 player games, but also in the 4 player games, it should not be underestimated. If you go for the pyramids and maybe then continue with something that doesn't produce a lot of culture, maybe you go for Pyramids Forbidden City, or you just build up some economy normally, you probably will end up having a decent to strong economy. But if you don't complement it with something that at least scores you some culture along the way, which of course can also be a leader, then sometimes it can happen that you fall a little bit behind in culture, and that when you are at the end of H2, you realize, okay, I have that good economy, but the culture gap is actually significant, and it can maybe get a little bit tricky to close the gap again, especially if you're playing against some strong players who often manage to go for a strong economical setup while actually having produced already a little bit of culture. And then again, the Silk Road is quite handy, because it generally, I think the Silk Road in general is just a nice wonder that has both a useful economical benefit, the science income, plus the additional value that you get out of the yellow cards, but plus also providing some additional culture income, and to not maybe be too much behind if you go into H3. And when you have the pyramids, a wonder that has no basic culture income, then I think the 2 additional culture income from the Silk Road will also be especially useful. So I think on multiple layers, the pyramids and the Silk Road are just extremely strong together. course also because I think both of them are just quite some strong wonders, but the additional civil action will be extremely useful if you then go for the Silk Road later on, and the Silk Road gives you something that you maybe need or want to have if you have the pyramids as your setup. So if you have the pyramids, definitely look out for the Silk Road. Sometimes I'm even able to pay quite a bit for it, because I do think that combination works extremely well together. Especially also, sometimes you maybe go into alchemies or something, and then you maybe have already a nice science income going. You don't need the science production as much from the Silk Road, but what then can happen is that you maybe miss out on iron, and you are in a situation where you have good civil actions. Maybe thanks to the alchemy, you were able to also go into monarchy or code of laws. So you sometimes end up having like 6 civil actions, but you are on bronze mines, and that again is, of course, again a situation where the Silk Road shines, because the Silk Road has resource-wise the lowest cost. It's of course still costly because of the many civil actions, but in such a situation where you have that many civil actions but are low resource income, then of course the Silk Road is very convenient to build. And while you may be in this situation no need the science production as much, I think going from 4 to 5 science income is still a significant improvement, and also maybe makes it viable until the end of the game, because 4 science income definitely will at some point be too few, but 5 science income, especially if you are able to go for that early, can get you maybe all the way into H3, maybe even to the end of the game, depending on how the game goes. So then also the Silk Road, I think, works quite nicely in such a pyramid setup. Alright. Now we are entering the second last Leaders and Wonder synergy, and this time I actually have 2 leaders together with 1 wonder, because I think they synergize with the wonder in a very, very similar way, and I didn't want to just pick one of them over the other. And that's Sun Tzu or Eleanor plus the Library of Alexandria. So that is, of course, a relatively obvious synergy, but I actually think it works just very well, because with both Sun Tzu and Eleanor, you of course draw additional cards. If you seed every turn, then with both of them you will draw 2 additional cards. And with getting that many cards, it is of course extremely strong to keep a lot of cards in hand. And for example, you will draw a lot of defense cards, and it's strong to keep them in hand, either to defend yourself or to go for a colony. Keeping a variety of events in hand can be strong. Maybe if you enter H2 with Eleanor, keeping a war or something if you see some potential for yourself. Keeping important tactics. You will get so many cards, and especially for Sun Tzu in the early game, it sometimes really, really hurts if you can only keep 2 out of those cards in hand and have to discard all of the others. That can really hurt. And here is where the library comes into play, because the library of course allows you to keep an additional military card. And of course you can also use an additional military action. You can also go for the Colosseum, and that wonder also works quite well, maybe especially with Eleanor, because sometimes you don't want to finish it that early, and maybe Sun Tzu will be gone already. And that's also why I think the library works quite well with Sun Tzu, because the library gives you some economical benefits, meaning you oftentimes want to finish it very quickly anyway. And if you have the specific Sun Tzu library combination, I think oftentimes it might even be worthwhile to delay your second lab and get the library finished before that, just as quickly as possible, getting the economical benefits, but then also relatively early already, at a time where you maybe not normally would already have an additional military action, you then are able to keep more cards in hand for Sun Tzu, which I think is quite useful. And as said, for Eleanor, of course, the Colosseum might also work quite well in military actions in general, but the worth of the military action, if you have those leaders, I think is just more in being able to keep cards instead of being able to draw more cards, which of course is still useful, and especially if you have only 2 military actions and get your third, that is maybe still very true. But for example, if you have Eleanor, and then you maybe have already 3 civil actions, 3 military actions, for example, because you went to an H1 government form or something, and then if you have a 4th military action because of the Colosseum, that is useful. You can build some military and draw more cards. You can keep a lot of cards in hand. So the 4th military action will be useful. But maybe it's especially useful to keep more cards in hand. So because you already draw some additional cards anyway with Eleanor, the drawing aspect is not that important, and at this point rather the keeping aspect, and that gives you the Library of Alexandria, but just as a nice side effect, not as the main part of the wonder. You still get all of the nice other things, the science income, which is of course the most important, but and a bit of culture, more hand space also for your civil actions, for your civil cards, and then out of the sudden that normally somewhat nice side effect, which is of course also useful normally, being able to keep more cards in hand, but that becomes especially useful, and because of that I think that is actually quite a nice combination if you manage to go for Sansu plus library or Eleanor plus library, because the draws you get out of the leaders anyway, and then you need to keep those cards in hand, and you can do that with the library plus getting all of the other benefits out of that wonder. Alright, and with that we are now already at the last Leaders and Wonders combination that I want to talk about today, and that is a synergy that it's maybe not the biggest synergy, but I do think it actually works quite well together, and maybe at the first look, especially if you're learning the game new, it's maybe not that obvious, and that's Michelangelo plus the Himeji Castle. Because normally, when you think about Michelangelo, you maybe think about some wonders that give some happy faces, like St. Peter's Basilica, maybe the Great Wall, or you have the Hanging Gardens from HA, or you think about getting more productions going to build more wonders, like the Machu Picchu. And ideally, I go for Michelangelo when I realize that I have secured myself a relatively early copy of Iron, and that I realize that I will be able to set up some early resource income. And then I think Michelangelo is just quite strong to have in order to just go for a lot of wonders ideally. And that I think is the main benefit out of him. The culture production is not to be underestimated. It can also be a very strong side benefit, but it's maybe rather a side benefit. And the main benefit is to just get a lot of wonders, get all of their benefits, and wonders can't really be destroyed apart from Riches of Time. So you have some strong base production and a lot variety of base effects just on your wonders. You don't require any population for that, and that can be quite strong. However, in order to play it a bit more greedily with Michelangelo, Himeji Castle is just extremely helpful, because sometimes you maybe would be able to go for just in H2 then taking a wonder, finishing it, and being prepared already for the next wonder. And sometimes, of course, there will be some military pressure going on, and maybe you normally wouldn't be able to do that because you need to build some military first and maybe need to be a bit more concerned about the military. But if you have the Himeji Castle built with Michelangelo, first of all, it's a wonder that requires only 2 steps, so we can just take it very cheaply with Michelangelo. It really costs only a few civil actions, and as I said, ideally you have Michelangelo if you have secured yourself an early iron income, and with that early iron income the resource cost is not the biggest burden to overcome, and it's extremely cheap from the civil action cost with only having 2 steps. So you can build it somewhat cheaply. And then, you have the Himeji Castle, you have the 2 strength, you have the ability to sacrifice, and that then after that will allow you to maybe go for wonders even more greedily, really try to max out what you can do with Michelangelo, and go into a very strong wonder setup. And the Himeji Castle then of course will also be nice in the late game. So I do think that is a wonder that you maybe also can look out for if you think about, can I maybe go for a really strong Michelangelo game? Himeji Castle might really help you to invest a lot into the wonders and not be too much concerned about also building a lot of military. And I think the railroad, of course, also works quite well with Michelangelo. If you get that early, first of all, it gives you even more production, and a 5 strength also will be extremely useful oftentimes. Alright, so with that we have discussed all of the Leaders and Wonders combination that I wanted to talk about. Now, of course, I'm very interested to hear first of all how you like this video idea. Doing a little bit more of a talk again, like I did it maybe a year ago when I did the tier list videos and then the event talks. So now I bit of a talk video again, and yeah, I hope it was somewhat interesting for you to hear about those leaders and wonders combination that I thought about. Probably most of them were mind-blowing to you, but I hope some interesting thoughts were shared. And of course, I'm also very interested to hear what maybe you think are some really overlooked or maybe underrated leaders and wonder synergy, maybe a combination that you think is actually quite synergistic, but for some reason no one talks about it. I'm very interested to hear if you maybe have some more combinations to share. And yeah, then I just hope it was an interesting video for you, that you did learn at least a little bit. And now, then I say thanks for watching, have a nice time, and see you in the next video.